fantastic Emma Alberici, presenter and of ABC's Late Line and journalist extraordinaire and mate. Good day, Emma. How are you? Good to see you. So good to see you. Fantastic. And Maria Halasz, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Cellmid Pty Ltd. Dr. Megan Baldwin, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Circadian Technologies. Of course, the outstanding Professor Mary O'Kane, New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer. Mary, you don't have Princess the Snake with you today. She
works up till about 11 a.m.
Yeah. Yesterday, Mary came to launch Science Week for us at the Australian Museum, and she stood there the entire time with this amazing snake around her neck and arms, and it was tying her hands together.
Even more importantly, Ian Jacob took over Lizard for me, so he stood there wearing the beautiful orange lizard that I'd been wearing while I had to look after Princess.
Yeah, that's right. It's all right. We've had a go at him this morning. You'll be pleased to know he had to leave, but he was here in full force this morning. Fantastic. And also, of course, Dr. Kate Wilson, who is the Executive Director of the Science Division of the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage. Please welcome our panel, who are going to look at women in leadership, busting some of those myths and challenges. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emma.
Thank you very much, Kim. So I thought, first of all, we should start with perhaps some personal anecdotes so we can learn a little bit about our panellists and how they made it to the positions they got to in science leadership, with a specific emphasis on how they overcame gender impediments, if we put it that way. And I thought I might just start with a very quick anecdote of my own about the kind of everyday hurdles we need to clear before we can get to those kind of next marks in our careers. And I was explaining this to the panel earlier that, you know, for a journalist, making it to the ranks of foreign correspondent is kind of considered the pinnacle, really. And so when I was appointed Europe correspondent as the first woman with children, and I had 3 under 4, one who was just 5 months old, I was appointed while I was on maternity leave. So, you know, big ups for the ABC. So there wasn't really much in terms of precedent to go by, and I kept asking my male bosses, you know, what about schools? What about where do we live? And, you know, what happens with, can my husband work? And, you know, all these things. And I kept getting fobbed off, and they wouldn't take my calls or have meetings with me. And finally, I had a meeting with my boss the week before I was leaving. And I was, you know, horrified about all this logistics that hadn't been sorted. And he said, "Listen, Emma, stop. Usually the wives sort all that out." Right. So, yes, and just on the issue of conscious and unconscious bias, just yesterday, a female newspaper columnist referred to me as Tony Jones' sidekick. So anyway, back to science, which I'm sure is far more sensible. I might start with you, Megan.
Well, hi everyone. I guess I'll give a little bit of background about my journey through my career. I did a PhD in Melbourne and very quickly knew that I wanted to travel overseas to do a postdoc, and went overseas and did a lot of interviewing around the San Francisco area, and I was very fortunate to come back and have 4 out of 4 offers on the table for me to undertake postdoctoral research at three very well-respected university hospital departments, and another one at Genentech, which was really my ideal job. I knew at that point that perhaps academic research wasn't so much what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to do research, and I knew that I wanted to get exposure more on the drug development side. But I came back and I literally said to my PhD supervisors and lab heads and said, "Look, that's really the job that I want, but I couldn't possibly take it." And they said, "Well, why couldn't you take it?" I said, "Well, it's just going to be so hard. That's the position that everyone wants." Yet I had this offer on the table, and here I was doubting myself that I, for some reason, wouldn't be able to execute and wouldn't be very successful at it. And the one thing that my lab head said to me at that point, he said, "Do not let your insecurities, your own self-doubt stop you from taking that position. If that's the one that you want, you go out and you take it. And that's indeed what I did, and it really did set me up on the path that I wanted to take, and that was research, but more in the pharmaceutical biotechnology area. And I was really grateful. Sometimes it is really literally one line from a mentor or from a supporter to guide you in the right direction. And I would say that you don't need to have in-depth discussions. Sometimes you just need the guidance to take a look at yourself and say, geez, I can do this. So I was fortunate. I had a really great manager when I was at Genentech, and I did a postdoc in one of the leading groups, and at that point was able to sort of really network in the company, find out what else would be available to a person with a PhD who really liked science but wanted to get into different areas of science. And I literally spoke to everyone. I didn't speak to them with the intent of getting a job. I spoke to them about learning what else was out there. And I managed to get a job in the commercial division, which was essentially going stealth within the company because it was frowned upon as a scientist to move outside of research and into the dark side of corporate business development or market planning. And but I have to say it was the relationship building that enabled me to do that. And I think that's what a lot of women can bring. You can bring that warmth and that relationship that can really help you along in your career. At that point, I'll just make mention that was the point that I got pregnant and had my first child overseas. And the company was just so supportive and did absolutely everything that they could to set up childcare, set up support networks, albeit there was an expectation you would go back to work within 8 to 12 weeks after having the baby. I came back.
You did?
I used every bit of maternity leave and vacation time that I had to me, and I went back at the 5-month time point, which was already, quite a challenge by Australian standards and expectations. And that's another topic, but yes, it was very challenging. I then worked for about another year and then returned back to Australia. I took on a job at a biotechnology company of which I'm now CEO, and have really just rolled my sleeves up and did a lot of different jobs, all scientifically based, but was really willing to take on the opportunity. And I guess that's what stood me in good stead for now being the CEO and managing director of a listed company. So my message would be, have faith in yourself, and it will all work out, and surround yourself by smart and really supportive people, because they're the ones that you're going to pick up the phone to and get guided along the way.
Fantastic, thank you. Maria?
So I came to Australia when I was 19. I was born in Hungary, and gender differences in Hungary when we were growing up, women were driving tractors. So as far as I was concerned, I could do anything. So I actually didn't come here with any preconceived concept of not being able to do anything. So, however, I came here and I was 19 and I was in medical school in Hungary. And when I arrived, I didn't speak much English at all. So the first thing I was advised to do is go back to medicine and learn English. So I think I must be one of the first people, or the only people in the world who went to medical school to learn English. Anyway, I transitioned through science, and then I did an MBA. I was a little bit of a twisting and turning soul through academia for a while, and my very first job was in a biotechnology company. And then spent 4 years there, and I was headhunted by a corporate finance team in one of the venture funds. So I spent 14 years in corporate finance, and during that time I gave birth to my child. And just talking about Megan's expectations of going back to work, I got a huge bunch of flowers from my bosses on the day when I gave birth. It arrived in the hospital, and I was so pleased. I thought, what nice guys, I love them so much. And then I got a call in about an hour saying, so when are you coming back to work? Okay, so fair enough. And I did go back 3 weeks later, indeed, because it was expected that the deal has to be done. So actually biotechnology to me after that, after 14 years of that, was like a breath of fresh air. When female participation is 20%, not 8%, where you could get to a very senior role. And in fact, I think the biotechnology is the one industry where there's a number of female CEOs of listed companies, and I'm one of them.
Why do you think that is?
Everybody asks this question of us. Why do you think? I think traditionally people say it's because scientists form a major group of biotechnology employees, and scientists are more willing perhaps to go forward and take these leadership roles. I don't know. I really don't know. I think partially it's because we're really poorly paid and men just don't want to do our jobs. It's a really, really tough job to be a biotech CEO, and I think to do it well, you have to work very long hours, 7 days a week. I mean, Megan knows exactly. So I think it's a tough job, and it's not particularly well paid compared to other listed CEO jobs.
I'm sorry. I'm coming to you, Mary, but I want to know why. Why do female CEOs put up with being paid so much less than other sectors? In the biotech field, or male or female, why is the sector...
I think it's that the sector is generally not revenue generating. It's a drug development program, it's long endpoints, you're expected... I've literally had people say to me, you should be working for X amount of money and incentivised to, down the track, if in 10 years you make a drug come to market, but in the meantime, who's going to pay my mortgage and who... And it's not that... You certainly get paid, I would say you get paid better in our role than what you do in many academic positions. And I think there's a positive angle, but more could be done. But
Yeah. By the way, I think we as women get around the same pay as men in our sector. So I didn't really mean to suggest that we get paid less as biotech CEOs as other biotech CEOs that are male. Generally, the sector is poorly paid because there's a perception of this as you're actually using shareholders' money, and you have to use it for research and developing your technology to commercialization rather than paying really high salaries, particularly in early stages.
Mary?
Thanks, Emma. I'm the oldest one here, and so I'm only going to just pick a couple of incidents, if you like, from my career. And I'm going to pick up on that topic straight away. When I was Vice-Chancellor of Adelaide, you do a lot of opening of things, and I was asked to open the Industrial Relations Conference that Adelaide was running. It had a lot of expertise and research going on in that, and there was one on wage equality. So I went down to open it, and of course, the papers were largely about payment for nurses and payment for things. And I opened and I used some statistics about the payment of vice-chancellors. And I'd rung my colleagues around the country, and I had the stats for men and women. And while vice-chancellors are very well paid, the male vice-chancellors were very much better paid than the women vice-chancellors. Now, of course, vice-chancellor salaries are negotiated between the chancellor and the incoming vice-chancellor and the council or whatever. But to me, it was a real lesson in maybe women didn't negotiate on their behalf enough. Anyway, it was an interesting talk. I then want to go back and talk about a space I claimed a long way back before that. I was in Canberra for quite a long time and was the Dean of Information Science and Engineering at the University of Canberra at the latter period of that. And because I was an engineer woman at the time of the Dawkins reforms in Canberra, I got appointed to everything. I was so lucky. And I really was. I mean, I was very lucky, and maybe I performed all right and then got reappointed to things. But one of the great things, of course, some of you the older people know here, I was a chair of the Research Grants Committee of the Australian Research Council, as it then was, the discovery grants part of it, but it was its own separate system. And when I took over chairing that, I did an analysis of how women fared in the what were the large grants, the now discovery grants, and how people fared by age. And I found that while women were doing okay, they weren't doing brilliantly, and practically nobody under 40 at that period was getting a large grant. And so at the first meeting of the RGC, the Research Grants Committee, I said, over the time I'm chairing, I don't believe in positive discrimination, above all in competitive grants. But in the 3 years, we are going to change it. We are really going to make sure, and I was just about to say young female women do well, young and female people do well, realised it was 1991, politically correct Canberra, and I said, that early career researchers are going to do well. And I invented the term, and it's the best thing I have ever done in my career. Thank you. And I wanted to mention that as something about the power of language, that I think, as well as negotiating for things like salary, we need to think about how we term things. Then my last anecdote, again when I was Vice-Chancellor, late in the period I was Vice-Chancellor, I'd pushed a lot of change because I thought I was supposed to do that. I was supposed to deliver for the government and deliver for the university and make sure the bottom line grew and the quality of the research and the quality of education was tremendous, and didn't everyone in the university want that? And various advisors were saying to me, there's a lot of unrest out there, your popularity's waning. And I said, I'm doing the right thing. And they said, look, be careful. And one day I had a coup. And I decided to resign about 40 hours later. And it was over management style. And I think there's a really interesting lesson about doing what you're supposed to do, as maybe how far you can push things, and I don't know. And I'll leave it there and pass over to Kate, who has a wonderful set of stories.
You won't elaborate on what you mean? What?
I think...
Why did you resign?
Why did I resign? Because I was angry, was the real issue. I was so pissed off, to use a very ladylike term, because I had worked so hard. I had pushed and worked, and I'd worked round the clock, and family issues, my partner, he had a senior political job, but we just rarely saw each other. And I thought, I've done all this, and this is, what you get for it. And I think the real issue, though, the right answer would have been to stay there and stare it down, possibly, although maybe I'd pushed enough change. But I think the times you can push things to a certain level, and I often wonder how far you can push them beyond the place they'll go. And that's it. I don't know. I'm throwing it out there because with this great audience, I recognise a lot of wonderful people here. I think this is the sort of audience that can discuss that and really, have some great insights.
Thank you. Kate?
So I come from the UK originally. I started off, went to Cambridge, and I did a PhD at Harvard, so I started off in molecular biology in the early days of that. So I started off very strongly academic environment, but always had a very strong interest in how the science was actually going to be used and applied. So I guess unlike Emma, in my career I've been all over the place. I did my PhD in the US, spent some of that time actually in India working in a practical environment, came back to the UK for a while, spent a bit of time working with the United Nations in Vienna, and ended up in Australia setting up an organisation called Cambia that was using molecular biology in Asia. So a lot of travelling. Then did a big shift, moved up to Townsville to the Australian Institute of Marine Science, initially working in the lab, but gradually got more into management and set up a very big collaboration with CSIRO. And this was a big achievement because CSIRO and AIMS have been just fighting all this time. And we managed to set up this collaboration and get a large amount of funding to do some research on prawn reproduction. And that set me up well for getting a subsequent job at the CSIRO, which is what brought me to Sydney. So I joined they were then the research flagships, these multidisciplinary new initiatives across CSIRO. Joined one of those as a science director. And this is probably my biggest, I've also lots of stories around family and a lot of those individual things, but reflecting on Lisa Williams' talk before this session, that seesaw with the agentic versus the warmth kind of opposed to each other, that really came into play when I was at CSIRO. So I was the science director for this flagship. The director got promoted upwards and there was a vacancy for acting, and somebody else a man was put in. Lovely man, very good, but I wasn't even asked, I was passed over. And I got really angry. I thought, I've got to go and talk to my previous boss about what's going on here. And it turned out I'd had a conversation with him only about 4 weeks earlier when he talked about my career aspirations, and I did have young children at the time, and I was struggling with travel kids, and I kind of said, oh yes, maybe interested, but I'm thinking about this. And he'd taken that to interpret that I wouldn't be interested in acting. It was that taking something I'd said and interpreting it. I then going to get this job because the job was advertised, and put a lot of effort into the networking, and I was appointed eventually as the director. Again, it took the CSRO a long time to actually be brave enough to appoint me. And I think, again, that goes to that agentic warmth thing, because there was endless discussion around leadership style, and in the end, and I got re-interviewed again, and I had to say to them, this is the style you're going to get if you appoint me. We're talking a lot more about needing collaboration, all of these attributes, but a lot of the criteria for promotion are still, I'm going to use this word all the time, thank you, Lisa, these agentic ones. So it really took them a long time to appoint me, and to this day, I'm no longer with the CSRO, but they've still got very few women in those senior leadership roles, and I think a lot of it comes to desire to collaborate, but still valuing those other kind of traits. I was then very fortunate. I got a call out of the blue from the woman who's then the Director General of the State Environment Agency, and she was looking for a head of science, and it quickly transpired this was just a fantastic opportunity to be able to use my science in a way that's really influencing decisions that are made around the environment for New South Wales on a daily basis. So moved there about 5 years ago, and again would really been in an incredibly supportive environment where I can do great things, collaborate with some of the great women and men at universities like New South Wales as well, and really being able to use a lot of those skills that I'd learned to actually, I guess, bring them all together in this kind of leadership role now.
I want you all to reflect on the numbers, and specifically CSIRO. Women make up 40% of the staff, but only 24% of the research scientists. And I noticed that according to the SAGE Steering Committee, SAGE being the Science in Australia Gender Equity Steering Committee, women comprise only 17% of level D and above positions in universities, less than 1 in 5 professional positions in science occupied by women. When you look at those figures, are there particular challenges to lifting those numbers that are specific to science? Megan, do you think?
Well, I'll talk about my experiences. When I went through my PhD, it was similar to that. At that point, there was a lot of women. I had equal numbers of male and female colleagues, and as I've moved up, there are we're well represented, I think, in biotech. But I was at a conference last week at a CEO dinner. I was essentially the only employed female CEO in the room, and that's a lonely place to be, really. So the question for me is, why is there such that rate when you go up into the executive leadership positions? And I really don't have the answer, frankly. I think there is definitely subconscious bias going on, and to your point, I think some of it is if you can't see that you can move up in your own little micro environment, and you can't make any further change, sometimes you need to think, well, I've got to step out of this and go and get another opportunity somewhere else so that you can be recognised for what you can bring to the table. And that's really my point about making sure you're surrounding yourself in an opportunity and in a culture where you can grow. Because I personally haven't experienced a whole lot of impediments to my career development, but I talk to people all the time where there's basically hurdles for people to actually really grow in their position. And I think at that point, sometimes looking internally and saying, is it time to step out? If you've done as much change and that you can do, go and grab what you want, what you need.
Maria, to what extent do you think it's a matter of what the Facebook COO, Sheryl Sandberg, talks about lean in, and we've talked briefly about this already, about the fact that women don't propel themselves forward enough. And in her book, she writes that some really amazing statistics that, and this is across sectors, and she's in the technology sector, and she talks about the fact that at graduation, if a woman and a man both have identical qualifications and they're going for a job, in 60% of cases, 60% of men will argue for a higher salary. So they have no experience. All they have is a university qualification, but 60% of men will go in and argue about why they should get more money. So it's not because they've got more experience or whatever, and only 7 to 8% of women will do it. And then the other interesting thing that she talks about is, again, another interesting statistics. If a man and a woman are going for the same job and they have the same experience and qualifications, and there are 10 prerequisites to the job, and the woman has 6, she won't go for the job because she doesn't have those 4. A man might only have 2, he'll go, yay, I'm the best guy for this job, I'll be fine. And that is consistently, in her research, found to be the case, that women don't put themselves forward. So in a very long-winded way, Maria, I'm asking you, is that your experience, that women sometimes are their own worst enemies, that they don't put themselves forward?
I think it's both. I think Mary made a really good point earlier about, we perceive leaders, a lot of the leadership qualities, male qualities, and we've discussed the fact that so many of the ASX 200 companies are led by men, and there's a very small participation of female leadership in that category. And especially very small participation of science or engineering background qualifications, because even women, when they get appointed to that kind of role, they come from either legal or accounting background. And I think we still associate, women being useful if they've got this specific qualification or contribution to be making. But I think you just, as women, we have to kind of assess how much do we participate in our own failure to get to those positions? And I completely take your point around, if there's 10 criteria and women have 5 or 6 of them, they won't go for the job. I think it's so true. I think we have to continually look at ourselves and say, how much is it me that I'm not getting further ahead than what I want to be? But I think there's also very big external inertia. And it is in society everywhere. And there's not one single answer for that, of course. There are groups and associations that are doing a very good job at breaking down some of those barriers. But there's not one single answer.
Mary, what's your view of quotas?
I'm not a fan at all of quotas. And I want to sort of, in addressing the general issue, pick up what my colleagues have said. There's not one single answer at all around this, but I do think in the issue of science, and going back to the promotion issue and why we're not seeing women going on, one thing I do have noticed often is that women seem a little more reluctant, on average, it's a slight generalisation, to actually see themselves as the leader of research groups at a very young age. I have got this group, I've got this burning hypothesis to test, I want to and I know I will have to raise an absolute mozza in terms of amounts of money to fund it, and I'll build my group. And I think a lot of that is terribly important, that from a very early age, women need to have their own scientific vision, or engineering vision, and know that they're going to have to fund it and drive with it. And that the promotion issue is not just about meeting the criteria, it's about things that you're not often told about. That what is it that's a very successful academic? It's the person who's in charge of something, and the first thing you're in charge of generally is your own research group. And you need that to be big, impressive, well-networked, dominating the rest of the world.
Very good advice.
But the reason I asked you specifically about quotas was that we're clearly not getting there fast enough. And we were talking earlier in the room to the side about Megan's just joined the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and I noticed they were crowing in a recent press release about the fact that they've got this target of reaching 30% female board members by 2018. So I just thought, wow, what an aspiration. But, they did mention that it had doubled from 8% to 20%.
Can I interrupt, Emma, to say that I probably should qualify what I said to you. I don't really believe in quotas at a level of a department or at a level of a school. But I do believe possibly in quotas at the level of a nation, like the Norwegians did about boards. That unless, by such and such, we're going to have 40% women on all the boards, or company, or there is some sort of national hit taken. Similarly, I think I don't even favour it for at a university level, but for the higher ed sector and the research sector, I think quotas there at those macro levels can be quite important,
Possibly
with targets within
and
it.
possibly in the federal cabinet, but that's another.
And possibly the federal cabinet, all cabinets, rather than just one cabinet, the federation.
But as a matter of fact, I was in Europe during the Norway situation,
Yeah.
and I arrived in 2008, and they had from between 2004 until 2008. Their top companies on the listed exchange, they had those 4 years to get to 40%. And they were at about 20 or so when they started. So they had quite a way to go. And at 2008, at the finishing line, I spoke to the male parliamentarian who was most fiercely opposed to this this policy in 2004. And when I interviewed him in 2008 about the experience and getting there, he told me that he'd done a complete 180 and he was now the biggest fan of quotas, because he said what he learnt through the 4 years was that in 2002 and 3 and 4, the way chairmen recruited directors was like this. They went to their golf course and their tennis club and their dinner party guests and asked around the people they knew. And when they were forced to look beyond their circles, they found some talent who had merit, who were women. Who'd have thought? And so it forced them to go and look for the women who are clearly out there if you just go and look for them. So he said, you know, he was now the biggest fan. And what's really interesting that is throughout the EU, there are so many Norwegian women on boards throughout the whole of Europe, because Norway did the hard yards and found them.
We all should re-listen to your interview. Maybe you should put it up somewhere. We should all listen.
Yeah, well, it was just interesting to hear that experience of you know, debunking the whole merit argument that they're not out there. They perhaps don't put themselves out there, but you have to go and you have to do a bigger job finding them. What do you think, Kate?
I think there are a lot of creative ways you can use quotas, so that boards is perhaps a good example, or, you know, at a more micro level. So the WEHI has been running this program where they're requiring to have, you know, equal numbers of female speakers, I think, in scientific seminars. Or I have a lot of scientific advisory boards, and I insist that I've got women on those boards, you know, as well. Often the women do still tend to be the younger ones, but that's fine. They bring so much greater thinking and diversity of expertise and to the groups. It's absolutely not just tokenists. So I think just by insisting that you've got that greater visibility of women, you can certainly use quotas at those levels. Equally in recruitment, you can require, you know, if you're using a recruitment company, you can these days require them to bring you an equal proportion of well-qualified female candidates to consider, even if you don't have a quota at the final appointment stage. So I think there's, you know, without numbers, things don't happen.
Emma, can I, at the risk of hogging things, tell my best quota story? When I was at the University of Canberra in '88 was put under the ACT government. It had been a federal government, CAE. And when it was put under the ACT government, there was a period of Labor government in the ACT, and they declared that every committee of the ACT government had to be gender balanced. And that included all the statutory authorities like the University of Canberra. And we had a good Vice-Chancellor, Roger Scott. He said, we'll do as we're told, everything's got to be gender balanced. The council, the academic board, every selection committee, the lot. This is 88. And everyone said, we're not going to be able to do it. You know, the council's already said. No, he said, we'll spill the council. We spilled the council, the academic board. But it says you've got to have this number of professors, this. Doesn't matter, we'll change the way it's composed. So very quickly, the university moved to completely gender balanced everything. And what it meant is that lots of relatively junior women in the university found themselves on all sorts of senior committees and boards of the university. And at first they were a bit quiet and didn't say a lot. And then they started to realise what they had to say made a lot of sense. And they started to be more assertive, and they were, you know, they were chairing the committees, they were doing things. They all thought, gee, I can do better than I'm doing. And it's Canberra, remember. There's always jobs advertised in the public service, senior policy jobs. They put up their hands. And they just got jobs all over the place. And suddenly Canberra, which hadn't been too bad in terms of numbers, so in total, went totally downwards because all these senior women who'd got on these boards flew off into senior jobs in the public service. However, it is a good story because it was a great example of women finding their feet, but still, it had this weird perverse effect.
I want to explore just one more issue before I open it up to everyone else to chime in with their questions, and that is the Annabelle Crabb dubbed wife drought. Basically, her thesis is that the reason we don't have more women in senior roles is that women don't generally have wives. That is, someone at home looking after all the stuff that women generally have to bear. And so she commissioned, actually, the Australian Institute of Family Studies to do some research on this, and she found that 76% of men working full-time have a wife or partner who doesn't work outside the home or who works part-time around their caring responsibilities. On the other side of that equation, among full-time working mothers, only 13% had a male partner who worked part-time or stayed at home. And then further figures showed that families, Australian couples, families with children under 15, 60% have a father who works full-time and a mother who stays home or works part-time. Conversely, only 3% of families have a full-time working mother with a male partner who stays at home or works part-time. And I just want you all to reflect on whether you think that is a big issue, that women don't have that support. So for all the will in the world at a workplace to help women reach those senior roles, if they're trying to also balance personal circumstances, looking after perhaps young children and parents, homes, then it doesn't matter what the policy is in the workplace. If they can't do that, then that might seem, a deal breaker. What do you think, Megan?
My number one piece of advice to any woman out there is marry well. Be really selective, because I have a husband who we do 50-50. We both have careers. He picks up the slack, I pick up the slack, and be reasonable with them and treat him well if he's treating you well. So there are times he's overseas at the moment. I have to run off after this to get home to get my kids who are currently with my parents. You just have to balance and you have to be reasonable. That said, the people that I interact with at this level are predominantly men who have a stay-at-home wife. I'm squeezing all of the home stuff in and expected to achieve everything that I need to do on the work front while doing all the stuff on the side, which is the washing, the ironing, all the rest of it, where they don't have to necessarily worry about that as much. How do I deal with that? I literally, and I would also tell this to every woman in the room, do what you have to do and accept it in yourself. I often go home, I'm a big believer in having dinner with my kids. You can do work after dinner, and don't self-impose that everyone's watching you and judging you on the number of hours and what you can and cannot do. I openly say to the people in my office, I have to go and pick up my kids today, or I didn't get to that, I will do it tonight. And just own that. If you're good at your job, you will make it work. But self-imposing that you need to be there until 8 p.m, it's not going to work in today's society, so be fair on yourself as well. That's what I would say.
A very quick anecdote from my boss, Kate Tawney, who's the head of News and Current Affairs at the ABC. She tells the story about she was the executive producer of a program, and she used to get in at 6 o'clock in the morning so she could balance that with her husband. So her husband stayed home and did the morning stuff and she did the afternoon stuff, and so she'd consistently walk out of the office at 3 or 4 to go and pick her kids up. Mm-hmm. And the news director would raise his eyes and look at her walking out and give her the really disapproving sort of head shake. And she got really annoyed after a little while, and one morning at 6 a.m. called him on his mobile, said, just thought I'd let you know I'm in the office, and how you going? What are you up to? Where are you? And he stopped doing the disapproving head shake, and it's true. It's you've got to actually own what you're doing, and not resolve from it, I guess, is the story.
I agree with Megan. The most important decision in your life is who is going to be your partner, I think, if you want to be in a leadership position. I think it's very, very important to have someone supportive. Having said that, I mean, we've got a couple of colleagues in biotechnology CEOs who are female, and I think we all have very supportive partners. It's very, very important. You can't do everything.
I agree with Megan. I think that's great advice. I will add one little bit, that a couple of the senior academic women I admire most, Faye Gale, who was the first female Vice-Chancellor of a Group of 8 University, UWA, and Jan Reid, who just finished up recently as Vice-Chancellor of UWS. I always was a bit, in my Puritan way, a little bit disapproving of both of the way they employed help in the home. Faye had a full-time housekeeper, Jan always had quite a lot of help, and both happily paid for it. I did talk about Vice-Chancellor salaries. But they made the point that unless you were totally comfortable with the support, you really couldn't do your job. But I just love the way younger women today do manage it much better than people of my generation. I really admire them.
The quote from her book, which I'll just quote out here, she says, "Being able to go to your job and concentrate on your work to the absolute exclusion of all else is something that our system assumes men and women are able to do equally, but that assumption is far from the truth." And I guess that's the point, that when women are at work, often they're thinking about the load of washing they forgot to do, or the children's assignment that didn't get finished, or whatever else. Kate, what's your view before we ask for questions from the audience?
Obviously, supportive partners, pretty crucial, but I think also, to me, part of it is, so I'm not originally from Australia, I still think there's that white picket fence element to Australia, and a kind of, almost we build up an internal expectation. And my little anecdote is, when we moved to Sydney because of my job, and my husband was working part-time when our second son was born, so he spent more time looking after Thomas, and he was looking after him when we first came here. Got Thomas into childcare at CSRO, so Thomas and I would drive off every morning. Thomas was about 3. One day he said to me, "Mummy, what does Daddy do every day?"
And you said that's an excellent question.
No, by that time he got a job. So I said, "He goes to work, he's got a job." And Thomas said, "That's funny, daddies don't work." And it just was such a revelation to me that I realised, I've been kind of wrestling a bit with my own self-imposed expectations of what the woman should do and the man should do. And Thomas, as a young, he hadn't picked up any of those expectations yet, and it sort of said, it's all fine, and he's comfortable with the way life is running, even if our house is absolutely not pristine, and sure, we get more takeout and all of those things, but it doesn't matter in the end. You've just got to be comfortable with doing that so that you can enjoy your job, enjoy your family, and get rid of the stress.
Fantastic advice.
Yeah.
I think we've only got time for a couple of questions, but I'm sure there are some out there. No, we've covered everything. I doubt it.
It's lunchtime.
Here we are. Emma.
So given we know so much about how many men actually have partners who aren't working full-time and how many women don't have the same thing, do you think we should actually have differential access to childcare arrangements? Because one of the things I struggled with was getting good quality childcare, getting childcare on campus, while I watched my colleagues who were male get their 3rd child in, and they had a stay-at-home partner. And it was on the basis that it should be equitable access, which I'm thinking might be an overly simple assessment of equity.
I think that's something that's being considered in the whole reimagining of the childcare system from a federal level. And there's some really great things they're talking about there that will, I think, try to address that within the structure of the tax system and the childcare rebate and so on. But yes, I think that's really hard. And for people like me who work nights, and nurses and other people, it's impossible. If you can't afford expensive nannies and so on, it's really, really, that's a really big issue. And I don't know what the answer is.
I have a friend who always says if you're going to get on one committee in the community, it's always the childcare board, because you can then help set the policies. And she, all through her life, she's now 61, 62, she has her sort of charity, if you like, is childcare boards, and it's about exactly that point. Setting the policies.
Absolutely. I think it's across the board in our society. The biggest problem for working mothers is, what are you going to do with your children? And so I think it's across the board. And certainly, if you are committed to your career beyond a 9 to 5, and you want to aim for a senior or leadership role, to have that ability to access some form of childcare is critical. Absolutely.
We have another question over there.
Hello. I had the opportunity recently to talk to David Gonski about women in leadership, and he said something that really resonated with me, and I'd be interested to have your thoughts about it. He said that for men, if they haven't made it to CEO by the time they're 45, they think they're not going to make it. But he said for women need to rethink the timeline and give themselves to 55 because they have had time out of the workforce, perhaps working part-time, and that we shouldn't be ruled by men's timelines. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Megan, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think everyone should be on their own timeline, but I sort of laughed a little bit because I've sort of had the opposite experience, which is I was appointed CEO at an age which really was comparable to the employment age for a male in the same role. But for 2 years have fielded almost every man in the sector saying to me, but you're so young. And I'm like, well, actually I've been studying this pathway for 20 years and I am really no younger than any other man in this role, but I am perceived to be young. I don't know necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily related to age.
Isn't there an implicit assumption in that comment that women need to be spending those earlier years with their families, which is a little insulting actually, because we need to, I think one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but in order for women to be able to step up, men have to step back. And that's something that men don't want to discuss. But I think very soon we're going to have to start that conversation a little more seriously about how men take on what were traditionally women's roles in the way that we now are expecting women to take on more of what were traditionally considered male roles.
And I think another issue with that is ageism, of course, that you consider yourself old for a full-time CEO executive role of a listed company when you're 55. I think, we're lucky if we grow up by the time we are in our 30s. I'm almost in my 50s. I still don't consider myself growing up, and I have so much to learn every day. And so, it is really terrible that in society we make this kind of discrimination against older, experienced workforce or people or leaders. I think it's very important that we have mature leaders in these key positions.
And I think just a final comment, Mary and Kate, because we're going to have to wrap
very
up.
quickly. I think that statement from David also implies a sort of pyramid-style career, which I think most of us talk about. You're going to get to the ultimate to be CEO. But is it the ultimate? And I think particularly in academic life, we actually have a whole range of different things. And I think the notion of flexible careers, men and women, and talking about it, how people might move around. There's a great person in the room who's sitting over there, Trevor Danos, who retired relatively early and is doing incredible leadership things at the moment. And I tremendously admire what Trevor does and the help he gives people like me in roles like that.
Kate.
I don't really have much to agree with all those comments. Maybe just note, sitting next to somebody from the ABC, there was a great piece recently that Geraldine Doogue did about the new dominance of some considerably older women, particularly in US politics with Hillary Clinton and Janet Yellen, is that the right name? Christiane Lagarde. So it was quite an interesting piece showing how the times can change, and actually there seems to be greater value coming with the experience that some of these women who bringing into their 60s and beyond, I think.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. There was so much more to talk about, but can I ask you all to thank our panellists? I'm sure you'll agree it's been a rich discussion. Megan, Maria, Mary, Kate, thank you very much.